The Ancient City, Book 4, Chapter 12. Rich and Poor, Democracy Perishes, the Popular Tyrants. When a series of revolutions had produced an equality among men, and there was no longer occasion to fight for principles and rights, men began to make war for interests. This new period in the history of cities did not commence for all at the same time. In some, it closely followed the establishment of democracy. In others, it appeared only after generations that had known how to govern themselves with moderation. But all the cities, sooner or later, passed through these deplorable struggles. As men departed from the ancient system, a poor class began to grow up. Before, when every man belonged to a gens and had his master, extreme poverty was almost unknown. A man was supported by his chief. The one to whom he owed obedience was bound in turn to provide for his wants. But the revolutions which had dissolved the genos had also changed the conditions of human life. The day when man was freed from the bonds of clientship, he saw the necessities and the difficulties of existence stand out before him. Life had become more independent, but it was also more laborious and subject to more accidents. Thenceforth, each one had the care of his own well-being, his enjoyments, and his task. One became rich by his activity or his good fortune, while another remained poor. Inequality of wealth is inevitable in every society which does not wish to remain in the patriarchal state or in that of the tribe. The democracy did not suppress poverty, but on the contrary, rendered it more perceptible. Equality of political rights made the inequality of conditions appear still more plainly. As there was no authority that was above rich and poor at the same time, and could constrain them to keep the peace, it could have been wished that economic principles and the conditions of labor had been such as to compel the two classes to live on good terms. If, for example, the one had stood in need of the other, if the wealthy could not have enriched themselves except by calling upon the poor for their labor, and the poor could have found the means of living by selling their labor to the rich, then the inequality of fortunes would have stimulated the activity and the intelligence of men, and would not have begotten corruption and civil war. But many cities were absolutely without manufactures and commerce. They had therefore no means of augmenting the amount of public wealth in order to give a part of it to the poor without despoiling anyone. Where there was commerce, nearly all its benefits were for the rich, in consequence of the high rate of interest. If there were manufactures, the workmen were slaves. We know that the rich men of Athens and of Rome had in their houses weavers, carvers, and armorers, all slaves. Even the liberal professions were almost closed to the citizen. The physician was often a slave who cured diseases for the benefit of his master. Bank clerks, many architects, shipbuilders, and the lower state officials were slaves. Slavery was a scourge from which free society itself suffered. The citizen found few employments, little to do. The want of occupation soon rendered him indolent. As he saw only slaves at work, he despised labor. Thus, economic habits, moral dispositions, prejudices, all combined to prevent the poor man escaping from his misery and living honestly. Wealth and poverty were not constituted in a way to live together in peace. The poor man had equality of rights, but assuredly his daily sufferings led him to think equality of fortunes far preferable. Nor was he long in perceiving that the equality which he had might serve him to acquire that which he had not, and that, master of the votes, he might become master of the wealth of his city. He began by undertaking to live upon his right of voting. He asked to be paid for attending the assembly, or for deciding causes in the courts. If the city was not rich enough to afford such an expense, the poor man had other resources. He sold his vote, and, as the occasions for voting were frequent, he could live. At Rome, this traffic was regular, and was carried out in broad day. At Athens, it was better concealed. At Rome, where the poor man did not act as a judge, he sold himself as a witness. At Athens, as a judge. All this did not relieve the poor man from his misery, and reduced him to a state of degradation. These expedients did not suffice, and the poor man used more energetic means. He organized regular warfare against wealth. At first this war was disguised under legal forms. The rich were charged with all the public expenses, loaded with taxes, made to build triremes, and to entertain the people with shows. Then fines were multiplied, and property confiscated for the slightest fault. No one can tell how many men were condemned to exile for the simple reason that they were rich. The fortune of the exile went into the public treasury, whence it afterwards flowed, under the form of triobolon, to be distributed among the poor. But even all this did not suffice, for the number of poor continued to increase. The poor then began to use their right of suffrage either to decree an abolition of debts, or a grand confiscation, and a general subversion. In earlier times they had respected the right of property, because it was founded in a religious belief. So long as each patrimony was attached to a worship, and was reputed inseparable from the domestic gods of a family, no one had thought of claiming the right to despoil a man of his field. But at the time to which the revolutions have conducted us, these old beliefs are abandoned, and the religion of property has disappeared. Wealth is no longer a sacred and inviolable domain. It no longer appears as a gift of the gods, but as a gift of chance. A desire springs up to lay hold of it by despoiling the possessor, and this desire, which formerly would have seemed an impiety, begins to appear right. Men no longer saw the superior principle that consecrates the right of property. Each felt only his own wants, and measured his rights by them. We have already seen that the city, and especially among the Greeks, had unlimited power, that liberty was unknown, and that individual rights were nothing when opposed to the will of the state. It followed that a majority of votes might decree the confiscation of the property of the rich, and that the Greeks saw neither illegality nor injustice in this. What the state had declared was right. This absence of individual liberty was, for Greece, a cause of misfortunes and disorders. Rome, which had a little more respect for the rights of man, suffered less. At Megara, as Plutarch relates, after an insurrection, it was decreed that debts should be abolished, and that the creditors, besides the loss of their capital, should be held to reimburse the interest already paid. At Megara, as in other cities, says Aristotle, the popular party, having got the power into their hands, began by confiscating the property of a few rich families. But, once on this road, it was impossible to stop. A new victim was necessary every day, and finally the number of the rich who were despoiled or exiled became so great that they formed an army. In 412, the people of Samos put to death 200 of their adversaries, exiled 400 more, and divided up the lands and houses. At Syracuse, hardly were the people freed from the tyranny of Dionysius when they decreed the partition of the lands. In this period of Greek history, whenever we see a civil war, the rich are on one side and the poor are on the other. The poor are trying to gain possession of the wealth, and the rich are trying to retain or to recover it. In every civil war, says a Greek historian, the great object is to change fortunes. Every demagogue acted like that Molpagoras of Chios, who delivered to the multitude those who possessed money, massacred some, exiled others, and distributed their property among the poor. At Messina, as soon as the popular party gained the upper hand, they exiled the rich and distributed their lands. The upper classes among the ancients never had intelligence or ability enough to direct the poor towards labor, and thus help them to escape honorably from their misery and corruption. A few benevolent men attempted it, but they did not succeed. The result was that the cities always floated between two revolutions, one to despoil the rich, the other to enable them to recover their fortunes. This lasted from the Peloponnesian War to the conquest of Greece by the Romans. In every city, the rich and the poor were two enemies living side by the side of each other, the one coveting wealth, the other seeing their wealth coveted. No relation, no service, no labor united them. The poor could acquire wealth only by despoiling the rich. The rich could defend their property only by extreme skill or by force. They regarded each other with the eyes of hate. There was a double conspiracy in every city. The poor conspired from cupidity, the rich from fear. Aristotle says the rich took the following oath among themselves: I swear always to remain the enemy of the people, and to do them all the injury in my power. It is impossible to say which of the two parties committed the most cruelties and crimes. Hatred effaced in their hearts every sentiment of humanity. There was at Miletus a war between the rich and the poor. At first the latter were successful and drove the rich from the city. But afterwards, regretting that they had not been able to slaughter them, they took their children, collected them into some threshing floors, and had them trodden to death under the feet of oxen. The rich afterwards returned to the city and became masters of it. They took in their turn the children of the poor, covered them with pitch, and burnt them alive. Footnote: Heraclides of Pontus in Athenaeus 12:26. It is quite the fashion to accuse the Athenian democracy of having set Greece the example in these excesses and disorders. Athens was, on the contrary, the only Greek city known to us that did not see this atrocious war between rich and poor within its walls. This intelligent and wise people saw, from the day when this series of revolutions commenced, that they were moving towards a goal where labor alone could save society. They therefore encouraged it and rendered it honorable. Solon directed that all men who had not an occupation should be deprived of political rights. Pericles desired that no slave should labor in the construction of the great monuments which he raised, and reserved all this labor for free men. Moreover, property was so divided up that a census taken at the end of the 5th century shows Little Attica to have contained more than 10,000 proprietors. Besides, Athens, living under a somewhat better economical regime than the other cities enjoyed, was less violently agitated than the rest of Greece. The quarrels between rich and poor were calmer, and did not end in the same disorders. End of footnote. What then became of the democracy? They were not precisely responsible for these excesses and crimes. Still, they were the first to be affected by them. There were no longer any governing rules. Now the democracy could live only under the strictest and best observed rules. We no longer see any government, but merely factions in power. The magistrate no longer exercised his authority for the benefit of peace and law, but for the interests and greed of a party. A command no longer had a legitimate title or a sacred character. There was no longer anything voluntary in obedience. Always forced, it was always wanting for an opportunity to take its revenge. The city was now, as Plato said, only an assemblage of men, where one party was master and the other enslaved. The government was called aristocratic when the rich were in power, democratic when the poor ruled. In reality, true democracy no longer existed. From the day when it was mastered by material interests, it was changed and corrupted. Democracy, with the rich in power, had become a violent oligarchy. The democracy of the poor had become a tyranny. From the 5th to the 2nd century before our era, we see in all the cities of Greece and of Italy, Rome still excepted, that the republican forms are imperiled, and that they have become odious to one party. Now, we can clearly see who wish to destroy it, and who desire its preservation. The rich, more enlightened and more haughty, remain faithful to republican government, while the poor, for whom political rights have less value, are ready to adopt a tyrant as their chief. When this poor class, after several civil wars, saw that victories gained them nothing, that the opposite party always returned to power, and that, after many interchanges of confiscations and restitutions, the struggle always recommenced, they dreamed of establishing a monarchical government which should conform to their interests, and which, by forever suppressing the opposite party, should assure them for the future the fruits of their victory. And so they set up tyrants. From that moment the parties changed names. They were no longer aristocracy or democracy. They fought for liberty or for tyranny. Under those two names, wealth and poverty were still at war. Liberty signified the government where the rich had the rule and defended their fortunes. Tyranny indicated exactly the contrary. It is a general fact, and almost without exception in the history of Greece and Italy, that the tyrants sprang from the popular party and had the aristocracy as enemies. The mission of the tyrant, says Aristotle, is to protect the people against the rich. He has always commenced by being a demagogue, and it is the essence of tyranny to oppose the aristocracy. The means of arriving at a tyranny, he also says, is to gain the confidence of the multitude, and one does this by declaring himself the enemy of the rich. This was the course of Pisistratus at Athens, Theagenes at Megara, and Dionysius at Syracuse. The tyrant always made war upon the rich. At Megara, Theagenes surprises the herds of the rich in the country and slaughters them. At Cumae, Aristodemus abolishes debts and takes the lands of the rich to give them to the poor. This was the course of Nicocles at Sicyon and of Aristomachus at Argos. All these tyrants writers represent as very cruel. It is not probable that they were all so by nature, but they were urged by the pressing necessity, in which they found themselves, of giving lands or money to the poor. They could maintain their power only while they satisfied the cravings of the multitude and administered to their passions. The tyrant of the Greek cities was a personage of whom nothing in our day can give us an idea. He was a man who lived in the midst of his subjects, without intermediate officers and without ministers, and who dealt with them directly. He was not in that lofty and independent position which the sovereign of a great state occupies. He had all the little passions of the private man. He was not insensible to the profits of a confiscation. He was accessible to anger and to the desire of personal revenge. He was disturbed by fear. He knew that he had enemies all about him, and that public opinion approved assassination, when it was a tyrant that was struck down. We can imagine what the government of such a man must have been. With 2 or 3 honorable exceptions, the tyrants who were set up in all the Greek cities in the 4th and 3rd centuries reigned only by flattering all that was worst in the multitude, and by destroying all that was superior in birth, wealth, or merit. Their power was unlimited. The Greeks could see how easily a republican government, when it did not profess a great respect for individual rights, was changed into a despotism. The ancients had conferred such powers upon the state that, the day when a tyrant took this omnipotence in hand, men no longer had any security against him, and he was legally the master of their lives and their fortunes.